I'm broke, but I'm happy. I'm poor, but I'm kind. I'm short, but I'm healthy, yeah. I'm high, but I'm grounded. I'm sane, but I'm overwhelmed. I'm lost, but I'm hopeful, baby. And what it all comes down to is that everything's gonna be fine, fine, fine. 'Cause I've got one hand in my pocket and the other one is giving a high five. I feel drunk, but I'm sober. I'm young and misunderstood.
The trans and non-binary community has been denied a seat at the table in the creative process for far too long, for decades and decades. But those of us who are on a more internal and invisible gender journey didn't even know there was a place at the table for us until Jagged came along, until Joe popped up on stage and demanded to be seen.
Is that I haven't got it all figured out just yet. But I've got one hand in my pocket and the other one.
Hey YouTube, I didn't expect that my first video on here would be something so personal or potentially controversial. The plan was and is for this channel to be largely video essays, film criticism analysis about various movies, TV shows, something that just is meant to just kind of educate and entertain more than specifically give you insight into who I am as a person. But there's a lot going on right now in the Broadway community, and specifically the Broadway fan community. There is a Broadway show called Jagged Little Pill that touches on a lot of very sensitive, serious subject matter, but does it in a way that makes it accessible to the audience, makes it human and very raw in a way that I don't know that hardly any other show is doing or even has done in the past. I think that the production team, the creators of this show, have done incredible work to bring a show like this to that kind of stage, to get people talking about topics that are hard to talk about. I mean, the whole overarching theme of the show is that we heal if we talk to each other. We can't heal ourselves alone by staying within our own struggles and not telling anybody about what we're going through. We have to open up and lean on one another in order to heal. So I think that production team is just, they've put a lot of work into having some really difficult, touchy conversations. So it's charged by a lot of things. And because of that, the Broadway community has really reacted to that show in positive and negative ways for a lot of obvious reasons, for a lot of justified reasons, because it is some really difficult subject matter to be exploring. But it does need to be explored. And I think that especially right now, as we're all still in the middle of a pandemic, still locked inside, still having to wear masks and social distance, I think now more than ever, we need empathy, and we're also taking the time to have these difficult conversations. And so I think we need a show like Jagged Little Pill to give us the space to do that. There's a lot of things going on in that show, but currently the really big controversy is surrounding the character of Joe, who was conceived by the writers, conceived by Lauren Patton, who was in the creative process from almost the get-go, and imbued the character with a lot of her own gender journey questions, struggles, was created to be a character who's on a gender journey and doesn't have it all figured out just yet. In the musical Jagged Little Pill, The song Hand in My Pocket is the first song that we see Joe sing, and that's sort of Joe's big solo number. Before You Oughta Know comes later. But the meaning of Hand in My Pocket, at least as it pertains to the character of Joe, is that Joe hasn't got it all figured out just yet. That Joe is sort of this wonderful mix of contradictions and is still trying to figure herself out. The fact that a character like Joe exists at all is incredible, is revolutionary. We've seen gay characters on stage before. We've seen bisexual characters on stage before. We've seen various aspects of the queer community embraced and celebrated in Broadway for years. And I think that a lot of the Broadway community welcomes queer stories and champions them and wants more and more and more queer stories to be told, because there are so many facets to the queer experience, to the LGBTQIA plus community. I mean, we're adding new letters every few years, it seems, and I think that's wonderful. So the words and the meaning behind them and the labels and all of that, they're ever evolving, and I think that's beautiful. And I think that we should be encouraging people to express themselves in whatever way they feel most comfortable, most safe, and the most them, the most that they are. And the character of Joe is doing just that. The character of Joe is trying to figure things out. This character is so new and important. So many people are seeing themselves and their experience through this character and projecting so much of what they need this character to be onto the character, that it's really just lighting this fire within the queer community about who should play the role, what should the role identify as, what is the right thing to do in this scenario to have the most inclusive, authentic story being told. I want to first talk about how the trans and non-binary communities, and I say communities because I think often those two get looped together. And I think that they can be. I think that you can be trans and non-binary. I think you can be trans. I think you can be non-binary. I think whatever label, whatever word you feel most pertains to who you are should be accepted. But that segment of the queer spectrum has been mocked and ridiculed and passed over and dismissed for decades, and has so little representation in pop culture even today. There's definitely a movement toward more inclusivity there, and particularly behind the scenes, which is, I think, one of the places that often gets forgotten. You think, oh, if there's a lot of trans actors doing stuff, then we're getting the representation we need. But the problem is we need people behind the scenes who also have stories to tell their stories. So the more people we get behind the camera, the more people we get writing those stories, the more authentic and the more multifaceted that experience becomes. And I think that there's a real history of transphobia and gaslighting that has permeated a lot of things and has been the right term for some of the stuff that has happened to that community, against that community. And so I think that there's sort of this knee-jerk reaction to assume that that's what's going on whenever something feels like an attack. And so a lot of people have been calling out the Jagged Little Pill situation as transphobic, as gaslighting. There have been actually several YouTube videos I've seen about it. The show did go through some changes from ART to Broadway, as every show does when it's being developed. And I really think that the initial reason that they took out some of the dialogue where Joe was questioning maybe being non-binary was honestly to avoid this kind of backlash. I think that they were trying at the ART production to be inclusive and allow people to interpret what they wanted from the character. And then when they moved to Broadway, they shied away from that because they were worried about the backlash that would happen. And they got it anyway. It's very much a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of scenario, especially when you're dealing with such sensitive subject matter. People are so ready to be defensive and offended. Anytime you're the first to do something, you are going to be raked over the coals because you're giving people a taste of that representation that they've been starved for so many years. And they want it to be exactly the representation that they need. And I think that the difficulty with something as sensitive and delicate as one's identity and gender and sexuality and navigating all of that is that when it's not cut and dry, when the gender journey that a person is going on is less obvious, is more invisible, and you have a show that's trying to honor that and trying to bring attention to a segment of the population who maybe didn't even know that they were being so starved for representation, didn't even know they could have a character that was going through what they were going through and see themselves on stage in that way, because they don't want to exclude that segment of the population by labeling Joe as trans or non-binary. It's a very new problem to be dealing with. Because it's new, we don't really have all the terminology for having those kinds of conversations. So when it's new and it feels like you have to be defensive because your identity is being passed over, I think it can feel like a personal attack when the conversation is around something that is so close to validating who you are as a person and your own life experience. When there's so much history of transphobia, and I say history, it's still going on. It's still very, very prevalent, unfortunately. But when that term and what it means are so ingrained in somebody, and there's such a negative connotation associated with that word, it makes sense that people would be speaking out against something that is labeled as transphobia. And, if that was what was going on, then I completely understand the anger. If the situation was as cut and dry as the character of Joe was always exclusively trans, non-binary, and we knowingly cast a cisgender woman as the character just because she's really talented. There's a big pocket of people who are sort of stuck with this narrative, and they're feeling, I realize it sounds like I'm speaking for them, and that's not what I'm trying to do. As I'm processing this whole situation and trying to be as objective about both sides as possible, this is just sort of how I've been trying to process it. So I feel like that pocket of the community who's so outraged right now, they're feeling gaslit. And I think it's because of the wording that the production team had when that question was addressed, whether Joe was trans or non-binary. Because the production team then said the character was never trans or non-binary. And so people who noticed aspects of that character that felt like they were on that side of things, that they were questioning a non-binary identity, questioning a trans identity, when pronouns like they and them were welcomed to describe Joe, it sort of cemented in people's minds, we're right, character's trans, non-binary. And so by trying to create more space for inclusivity and conversation about gender and identity and all of that stuff, they were almost digging themselves into a hole because people just took that and went with it. And it started this sort of spiral of people feeling like they knew who the character was. And so when they're told that they're not, they're like, well, you You literally are going back on what you said. When they released the video of like the process of creating the character and it wasn't the same narrative that they had in their brain, it really upset people. And so I can completely understand the confusion and the outrage with that narrative. But the truth is, it's messier than that. It's not as cut and dry as that. By saying the character was never non-binary or trans, what the production team is really saying is that the character was never exclusively trans or non-binary. And I think that space was created for a wide variety of actors who identify as bisexual, gay, queer, pan, trans, non-binary, gender fluid, to be able to assume the role of Joe. I think that the gray area in Joe's journey is the most inclusive way to tell that story. I think that the gray area allows for the broadest number of people to get to play that character and find themselves in that character. For trans and non-binary people, Joe is trans and or non-binary. And that's incredible because they don't have a lot of representation. And that's really exciting that this show gives them that. But what's happening right now is because of this perpetuation of the cut and dry narrative that Joe is exclusively trans, non-binary, should only be played by a trans or non-binary actor because of that. The ironic thing is that these communities who have been so dismissed, so marginalized, so looked over for so many years and know exactly what that feels like, they're doing the same thing to people who are on a different gender journey than they are. Every letter in the alphabet that ever winds up belonging to the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, to the queer community, is valid. And just because someone doesn't quite understand the complexities of someone else's gender journey doesn't mean that they should just dismiss it as faux or not as important. And I think the queer community, the LGBTQIA plus community, I feel like it's supposed to be this really welcoming place for everyone who identifies as something other than, you know, the heteronormative whatevers. But there's still these little factions that have their own little bits of judgment and lack of openness to seeing another way of how a person could identify or what a label would mean to somebody. The cis allies who are speaking out against Lauren, against the show, because of the outcry from the trans and non-binary community, when they're continuing to say it was always cut and dry, here are the reasons. And they pull up clips from the ART production that have scenes where they're talking about Joe not wanting to be called Joanne. This is where the nuance part of the haven't got it all figured out just yet aspect to Joe comes in, because there are multiple interpretations of what even that specific thing can be. For a lot of people who are aware of trans issues, who are in the trans community, someone calling Joe Joanne would be an example of dead naming. But there's also people out there who are cis, but mask of center. And the name Joanne is more feminine than just calling yourself Joe. And it could be just specifically about, I'm modifying my name to something that feels more like me, like how I present. I'm almost making this video as sort of a response or a reaction or a follow-up to the most recent video that Amy Lovett, I think that's how you pronounce her name, she's British and awesome, and I would love to have a dialogue with her. She posted about sort of an update to a video that she posted initially about all the controversy with Jagged Little Pill after they won a couple Tonys, and she was upset about it. In that video, she talked about the conversation that Lauren Patton had with Shakina Nafak, and she used the word ambiguous a lot, or ambiguity, with the way that Lauren was talking about her own gender journey, gender struggles, whatnot, and even called the conversation surface level, despite being, 40 minutes long. I almost smiled when she was using words like ambiguous and ambiguity, because to me, that's the point. And that's actually where the beauty of Joe lies, in the space that's created by that gray area, by that ambiguity. So to me, if anything that Lauren said sounded ambiguous, that actually even more qualifies her to play a character like Joe, because she can directly relate to the haven't got it all figured out just yet aspect of that character. That's so important to so many people. And as far as things being surface level, I mean, first off, Lauren doesn't owe anyone an explanation about how she identified, what her journey has been. And so the fact that she gave us any kind of insight into that is just admirable and brave. That's a incredibly personal topic, and she let us in. And I felt even more seen in a lot of ways by some of the things that Lauren talked about in there. I learned the term mask of center, which is absolutely how I identify, and I didn't even know that term until a couple weeks ago, because there's so little media out there. You really have to search for it or come across it like this to be able to find your labels and figure out what fits, which is another reason that the character of Joe is so important. And because Jagged only had its few months in tryouts in Cambridge, and then it only got about a few months on Broadway before the shutdown. So we barely had any time for anybody else to get to play the character. Lauren barely got to play the character for a full run, and just really hope that the show gets a chance to get to that point. I hope that people can let this be Lauren's turn. She originated this role. She created this role. She put her heart and soul and strength into this character, and deserves to get to tell this story the way that she created it. And then when she's done, someone else will get a turn to tell their version of Joe's story. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's exactly what Joe should be. I'm worried that all of this backlash that's coming at the show for trying to do something, trying to be as inclusive as possible, and the lack of appreciation for the gender journey that Joe is going on, and how that can be an all-inclusive aspect to that character, it's going to make other shows, other writers, other directors not want to try again. How many other shows on Broadway are making space for a character like Joe? I feel like so much of the vitriol that's being thrown at Lauren and at the show, it's so misdirected. Really, where it should be targeted is the rest of Broadway, the rest of pop culture that doesn't tell these stories, that isn't trying to tell a story like Joe's, isn't taking such care to try to be as inclusive as possible. We need more stories out there, and we need the nuanced stories. We don't need just like the typical stories. We need the stories like Joe's story of a character grappling with identity. It creates empathy. And I'm feeling a lack of that right now with all of the backlash. I think the important thing is to acknowledge that the queer community is vast and has a lot of letters and a lot of facets to it. And just because your experience may be more cut and dry than somebody else's, or you may not quite understand what someone else is going through, I still think you need to respect it and not dismiss it as either not happening or not as important. I think there's so little information out there, so little representation out there for the more niche or nuanced aspects of the queer experience, that we fall back on terms that we're familiar with. You know, I think that gender presentation, gender expression, and gender identity, they're all slightly different things, but it doesn't mean that a person who, for example, presents as Mask of Center isn't as important as someone who is trans or non-binary. We're going through different things, and we can't fully understand what the other person is going through, but in the end, it's about who we are as people, how we feel about ourselves, our place in the world, and by calling for more inclusion and asking the production team to just make Joe trans or non-binary and cast a trans or non-binary actor in the role, they're alienating those of us who saw themselves in the ambiguity of Joe, and they're alienating our own experience, our own gender journey. It's disheartening, to say the least. I felt so valid watching Joe, especially watching Joe go from this very shy, kind of hunched over, always wearing baggy, shirts and hoodies, to finale Joe, who is, very much wanting to be seen. There was a part of the conversation that Lauren had with Shakina where she talked about Joe wanting to be seen in the finale. And I think that's just everybody who's kind of going through that, haven't got it all figured out just yet, part of their journey, to see someone like Joe go through that and come out on the other side feeling much more comfortable in her skin. It's so important. That kind of representation is so important. I don't purport to speak for the trans non-binary community. I'm not trans or non-binary. I am a cis woman, and I realize that with that comes privilege, but I don't think that just being cis means that my experience is invalid or doesn't matter. I think it's important for all the stories to get to be told. I think that it opens your worldview a little bit to get to see other people's journeys explored. There's room for all of us under the queer umbrella of humanity, and I don't think we need to push each other out into the rain so that we can have a little bit of coverage. I think there's room for all of us under that umbrella, and I think Joe encapsulates that. I think that all of the exciting possibilities of what that character could be for different actors playing that character, I may resonate most with the version that Lauren Patton plays, because I'm Mask of Center, because I haven't got it all figured out just yet, but she's not going to be in the show forever. That's just not how Broadway works. The next person who plays Joe may be non-binary, may be trans, may be gender fluid, and it would be really cool to see how they interpret that character. But if the show gets canceled, then we're never going to get to see the other versions of Joe that could have been on stage, that could have given more representation to people. And I think that's really upsetting. I think it's the opposite of what the fans want, especially the fans who are calling for Lauren Patton to be fired. Let Jagged Little Pill do its thing. Let Jagged Little Pill be the beginning, be the doorway into more and more queer stories being told. So let them let them be, let them open, let them have their show, and don't call for inclusion by dismissing someone else's gender journey, I guess is the other message I wanted to say about that. I just think the character of Joe is way too important to just dismiss that gray area that's so important to so many people in favor of trans and non-binary representation. I think that trans and non-binary representation is a part of that gray area. And I look forward to seeing who takes the role when Lauren's done and how they interpret the character. So yeah, this I didn't plan for this to be my first video on this channel, but this is what's been in my brain for the past few weeks, and just kind of felt like I needed to share a little bit of a different perspective, and hopefully won't be crucified by the internet due to it. But I think that it's not about there being another side, it's about there's more facets to gender and the queer experience than in the sort of cut and dry angle that's being taken right now. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. So I have one more thing I want to say. There's a lot of people who are making a lot of assumptions about Lauren Patton and how she identifies, and she does use the pronouns she, her, and does identify as a cis woman, but in the video, in the conversation that she had with Shakina, she did sort of talk about how she went on her own gender journey while playing Joe and kind of figured some things out about herself while playing Joe, and is still kind of, hasn't got it all figured out just yet. And I think that it's important to remember that she's a person and she shared a little bit of her story with us, but there's so much more going on. Just kind of be sensitive to the fact that you don't know what a person's going through, and you don't want to assume that you know what they're going through, or that they're not qualified because of such and such reason to play a character like Joe. There was an article that Lauren wrote for Refinery 29, and I'll link it below because everybody should read it, where she really got very personal about navigating a bisexual plus identity within the queer community and the difficulties of not being straight enough, not being gay enough. And there's a song in the show, in Jagged Little Pill, called That I Would Be Good. And it really resonates with me for a lot of reasons, but Joe has a line that she sings where she says that I would be loved even when I am my true self. And she's kind of pleading for that validation. And I think we all need that. We all need to feel like we are valid when we are our true selves. And I think that Lauren has earned that respect from us, and I think people need to stop just calling for her to be fired, calling her a transphobe. There's so much hate that's going on right now, that's being directed at Lauren, who's dealing with a lot of stuff herself and still figuring some stuff out. And I think people need to stop just assuming that they know her intentions. So yeah, okay, first video done. Like and subscribe.